What I'm about to tell you is the story of how a paramedic stole $18.2 million from a cartel crash scene and vanished before SWAT could track him down. This case involved federal agencies, international manhunts, and one split-second decision that changed everything. The paramedic's name was Garrett Walsh, and this is his story. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Garrett Walsh was everything you'd want in an emergency responder. At 34, he had spent 11 years with Austin Emergency Services, working primarily night shifts along the Interstate 35 corridor. His colleagues described him as reliable, professional, and completely by the book. He had an impeccable record, no disciplinary actions, no complaints, no red flags that would suggest he was capable of what happened next. But beneath the surface, Walsh was drowning financially. His divorce 8 months earlier had left him with $73,000 in debt, spread across multiple credit cards and medical bills. Working as a paramedic in Austin paid around $45,000 annually, decent money, but nowhere near enough to dig out of the financial hole he'd fallen into. His partner, Damon Briggs, had worked with Walsh for 6 years and later told investigators he never suspected his colleague was desperate enough to risk everything. That desperation would soon be tested in the most extreme way possible. October 23rd, 2023 was a typical Tuesday night in Austin. Heavy rain had been falling since midnight, creating hazardous driving conditions on the highways surrounding the city. Walsh and Briggs were returning from a routine call when their radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. Unit 47, multiple vehicle accident. I-35 southbound mile marker 212. Multiple casualties reported. Fire department en route. The call seemed routine, exactly the kind of weather-related accident they responded to dozens of times each year. Their ambulance was 6 minutes away from the scene, and both men prepared for what they assumed would be another straightforward case of rain-slicked roads and poor visibility causing a multi-car collision. When they arrived at the scene, what Walsh and Briggs found wasn't a typical traffic accident. The middle vehicle, a black Escalade, had bullet holes in the rear window, and all license plates had been torn off. This wasn't an accident. It was the aftermath of something much more dangerous. The scene was eerily quiet despite the destruction. 3 vehicles were involved: a Honda Civic, the mysterious Escalade, and a Toyota Camry. The Escalade had clearly been the target, sandwiched between the other 2 cars in what appeared to be a coordinated attack. Steam rose from the damaged engines, and the smell of gasoline filled the air, but there were no sirens yet. Walsh and Briggs were the first responders, arriving a full 8 minutes before police backup. Walsh immediately began his assessment of the casualties. The drivers of the Honda and Toyota were conscious with minor injuries, likely civilians who had gotten caught up in whatever had happened to the Escalade. But the SUV told a different story entirely. 2 Hispanic males occupied the front seats, both unconscious and critically injured. The man in his 40s had multiple trauma wounds that Walsh immediately recognized as likely fatal. The younger man, probably in his 30s, had severe head trauma and was completely unresponsive. Based on his 11 years of experience, Walsh knew neither man would survive long enough to reach the hospital, but it was what he discovered in the back seat that changed everything. While performing his medical assessment, Walsh discovered something that would change his life forever. Scattered across the destroyed back seat were 4 large canvas duffel bags. One had split open in the crash, revealing neat stacks of $50 and $100 bills, more cash than most people see in a lifetime. Walsh's training kicked in automatically: assess, treat, transport. But his mind was racing as he stared at the exposed money. The bills were crisp, sequential, and professionally bundled. This wasn't personal cash or even small-time drug money. This was cartel financing, the kind of money that moved in 8-figure transactions and left bodies in its wake. He could hear sirens approaching in the distance. Police backup was maybe 90 seconds away. Briggs was busy treating the other drivers and hadn't noticed what Walsh had found. The 2 men from the Escalade were dying, their injuries too severe for any intervention Walsh could provide. In that moment, staring at more money than he would make in 500 years of honest work, Garrett Walsh made a decision that would turn him from a respected emergency responder into one of the most wanted fugitives in Texas. In the next 90 seconds, Walsh made a decision that federal investigators would spend months trying to understand. While continuing to provide medical care, he quickly moved 3 of the 4 duffel bags into his ambulance, hiding them under medical equipment. His movements were swift and professional. Years of emergency response had taught him to work efficiently under pressure, and now those skills served a very different purpose. He tucked the bags beneath stretchers and equipment, where they would be invisible during the chaos of emergency response. His hands never stopped working on the victims. Anyone watching would see a dedicated paramedic focused solely on saving lives. At 3:01 a.m., the cavalry arrived. Police cruisers, fire trucks, and a second ambulance flooded the scene with flashing lights and radio chatter. Walsh seamlessly transitioned into his familiar role, coordinating with other first responders and preparing to transport the survivors to Travis Medical Center. The scene was processed according to standard protocol. Police secured the area, investigators photographed the vehicles, and the remaining duffel bag in the Escalade was tagged as evidence. But in the controlled chaos of the emergency response, no one noticed that 2 bags had already disappeared. During the transport to the hospital, Walsh maintained his professional demeanor while sitting mere feet from $18 million in stolen cartel money. Both victims from the Escalade were declared dead on arrival, taking with them any immediate knowledge of what they had been transporting. Back at his apartment in East Austin at 4:30 a.m., Walsh finally confronted what he had done. Spread across his kitchen floor, the money told the story of a sophisticated operation. The bills were sequentially numbered, professionally bundled, and totaled exactly $18.2 million. This wasn't random drug money. It was the kind of cash that funded major cartel operations across international borders. As Walsh sat in his kitchen surrounded by $18.2 million, news reports began revealing the true scope of what he'd stumbled into. The crash wasn't random. It was connected to one of the largest cartel money laundering operations the DEA had ever investigated. Local news stations were already reporting the incident as suspicious. By dawn, mentions of DEA involvement began appearing in police briefings. Walsh's research into the vehicle registration revealed the Escalade was registered to a shell company with ties to known money laundering networks. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just stolen money from criminals. He had stolen operational funds from an organization that had killed people for far less. The cartels would want their money back, and they would want the thief dead. But even more immediately dangerous was the inevitable federal investigation that would eventually interview everyone who had been at that crash scene. Walsh had maybe 72 hours before investigators started asking detailed questions about the missing money. Over the next 3 days, Walsh transformed from a small-town paramedic into someone planning one of the most audacious escapes in recent criminal history. He called in sick to work, claiming flu symptoms, and used the time to research money laundering, identity theft, and international escape routes. His approach was methodical. $12 million was converted to cryptocurrency through various exchanges, a process that required multiple transactions to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. The remaining, $6.2 million was converted to gold bullion and high-denomination foreign currencies that would be easier to transport. On the 3rd day, the DEA announced they were investigating the crash as part of a massive cartel money laundering bust involving over $100 million. Walsh realized that investigators would eventually interview everyone who had been at that crash scene. The news report changed everything. Walsh was no longer just hiding stolen money. He was about to become the subject of a federal investigation. Through criminal contacts he had encountered during his years as a paramedic, he acquired false identification documents and began planning a complete identity change. But Walsh's careful planning was about to be interrupted by something he hadn't anticipated. He was already under surveillance. On day 3, he noticed an unmarked sedan parked across from his apartment building. Day 4 brought a different vehicle with different occupants, but the same professional surveillance pattern. By day 5, Walsh was certain. Federal agents were watching him, building a case, preparing to move. He had run out of time. The evening of October 28th, Walsh prepared for what he knew would be his last night in Austin. He had acquired a stolen motorcycle for the escape, mapped backroad routes to the Mexican border, and prepared an emergency kit with cash, documents, and supplies for extended travel. His window of opportunity was closing rapidly, but Walsh had one advantage. His years of emergency response had taught him to recognize the signs of tactical operations. At 9:47 p.m. on October 28th, Walsh watched through his window as 4 black SUVs took positions around his apartment building. The federal task force was moving in for arrest, and he had less than 3 minutes before SWAT breached his door. The vehicles moved with military precision, taking positions that would block all normal escape routes. Walsh could see tactical officers deploying around the building perimeter. In less than 3 minutes, his front door would be blown off its hinges, and his escape window would close forever. Walsh grabbed his prepared escape kit and moved to his bedroom window that faced the building's rear alley. The fire escape was old but functional, and he had tested the route twice during his planning phase. As he stepped onto the fire escape, he could hear radio chatter from the tactical teams below. At 9:52 a.m., as SWAT officers breached his front door, Walsh was already starting the stolen motorcycle in the alley behind his building. His escape route took him through the back streets of East Austin, areas he knew from years of emergency calls and late-night transports. The immediate manhunt was massive, but ultimately unsuccessful. Walsh reached Interstate 35 and disappeared into the late-night traffic heading toward the Mexican border. By the time federal agents realized he had escaped, Walsh had a 30-minute head start and a carefully planned route that avoided major highways and border checkpoints. The federal response to Walsh's escape was swift and comprehensive. A multi-agency task force was activated within hours, involving the DEA, FBI, U.S. Marshals, and Mexican federal police. Border crossing points were alerted, airports were monitored, and Walsh's financial records were frozen and analyzed. But Walsh had planned well. His cryptocurrency conversions had been routed through multiple international exchanges, making the money nearly impossible to trace. His new identity documents were sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, and his escape route avoided the major crossing points where federal agents were concentrating their search. 6 months after Walsh's disappearance, the DEA announced the arrest of 23 people connected to the cartel money laundering operation. They recovered over $75 million in assets, but the missing $18 million and Garrett Walsh were never found. The investigation had far-reaching consequences for everyone connected to the original crash scene. Damon Briggs, Walsh's partner, was interrogated for weeks and subjected to intense scrutiny that effectively ended his career in emergency services. Every paramedic who had been on duty that night was investigated, their financial records examined, their personal lives dissected by federal agents looking for any sign of complicity. The Austin Emergency Services Department implemented new protocols for evidence handling and financial monitoring of employees. The case became a cautionary tale about how trusted professionals could exploit their access to crime scenes for personal gain. Today, Garrett Walsh remains one of the most wanted fugitives in Texas. The federal warrant against him includes charges of theft, money laundering, and conspiracy. A 100-0 reward has been offered for information leading to his arrest, but no credible leads have emerged. Investigators believe Walsh successfully reached Mexico and may have continued to Central or South America. His cryptocurrency transactions stopped abruptly 3 weeks after his escape, suggesting he either found a way to access the funds without leaving digital traces or decided the risk of exposure was too great. The cartel whose money Walsh stole has never publicly acknowledged the theft, but law enforcement sources suggest the organization conducted its own investigation into the missing funds. Whether they identified Walsh as the thief remains unknown, but their silence on the matter suggests either they haven't found him or they have found him and dealt with the matter privately. The Garrett Walsh case represents one of the most successful thefts from organized crime in recent history. A respected paramedic with no criminal background successfully stole $18 million and evaded a federal manhunt that involved multiple international agencies. But the case raises fundamental questions about opportunity, desperation, and moral boundaries. Walsh had 90 seconds to make a decision that would either solve his financial problems or make him a federal fugitive. In those crucial moments, facing more money than he would make in multiple lifetimes, he chose to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The investigation revealed systemic vulnerabilities in how emergency responders interact with crime scenes. Walsh's access to the crash site was necessary for his medical duties, but that same access allowed him to steal evidence before other law enforcement arrived. New protocols have been implemented, but the fundamental tension remains. Emergency responders must have immediate access to save lives, but that access can be exploited by those willing to risk everything. This case raises fundamental questions about opportunity, desperation, and moral boundaries. Walsh had 90 seconds to make a decision that would either solve his financial problems or make him a federal fugitive. In the comments, tell me, if you were in his position, staring at more money than you'd make in a lifetime, what would you have done? Would you have followed protocol, or would you have taken the same chance Garrett Walsh did? Because the truth is, we never know how we'll react when faced with impossible choices until that moment arrives. And for Garrett Walsh, that moment changed everything.